In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the solenoid valve assembly on a washing machine. This is something you might need to replace if you notice that your washing machine is no longer filling properly with water. This is an LG front loader model WM2233HW, so the procedure might vary a bit if you have a different brand or different model, but hopefully this will give you a general idea of how to replace this part if you need to. Now, in case you have never tried to repair your own washing machine before, two very important things to remember. Shut off both supply valves, so the hot and cold water, or you're going to get a nasty surprise when you start disconnecting things, and leave those on. And as with any appliance, make sure you unplug it so you are not connected to power once you remove the cover to service the inside. You're also going to need to disconnect the hoses from the back where they connect to the machine. Sometimes you can loosen these by hand. I'm going to need to go get channel lock pliers because those are on there a little too tight. And when you do that, I'll show you in a second, these hoses have filters on them, so check to make sure those filters aren't clogged, because you might have a simpler reason that your washing machine is not filling with water before you bother taking it apart further and changing out these solenoid valves. Now, be careful when you disconnect these hoses because they are still going to have some water in them, so make sure you have a bucket, or in this case I have a drain pan below the washing machine to let that drain. Not going to be a ton of water as long as you remember to shut off the valve, but again, make sure you have somewhere for that to drain. And you can see I loosen that up, loosen both of these with the channel lock pliers that I have here, and then once they are loose enough, you can just unthread those by hand to disconnect both of the hoses. The next step here, if I zoom out, to start getting the top cover off the machine, at least on this model, is there are some screws on the back. So you can see that, if you look at the seam, there's this top piece, and I need to undo screws on the back that are holding the top piece down to the main body. So I'm going to undo those, and then this whole top piece is going to slide off. So I actually only needed to undo two screws. There's this bracket on the back that has a screw into the top, and then another screw into the frame. I took out the screw from the bottom, and now you can see if I kind of grab by this seam up front, I might need to get a flathead screwdriver. It's kind of hard to film and do with one hand, but there we go. And that whole top part slides off towards the back, so I'm going to have to put the camera down and use two hands to do this, but this whole piece is going to slide towards the back, giving me access to the inside of the machine. Okay, now we have gotten off the top cover and giving us access to the inside of the machine, and on the back here, you can see these solenoid valves. And there are 4 of these, one for hot, and then actually 3 different valves for cold, which I'll explain in a minute. But first, if you don't actually know what a solenoid valve is, it is this cylindrical thing that has an electromagnet inside. That electromagnet activates a plunger that lets water through. So when this gets energized, it pulls up on a little plunger and lets the pressurized water flow through these hoses. So each electromagnet has its own control wire, which is one of these plugs here that plugs into the electromagnet, and that's going to turn it on when it gets a signal to turn on from your washing machine, depending on what cycle it's running. If we look over at the back here, each one of those is connected to where one of the supply hoses was. So the hot supply hose goes directly to the lone hot valve, and then the cold supply hose goes to these 3 different cold valves. If we trace those, you can see each one of them then has one of these tubes that goes over to the back of this, which if I zoom out, that is the tray where you pour in all of your detergent and bleach and pre-wash and whatever all the other compartments in here are, softener. So I don't know if this text is going to show up in the video because it's, there we go, if I zoom in. So you can see one of these is for bleach, one of them is for hot, one of them is for pre-wash, and one of them is for the main wash. So again, there's one hot, and then there's 3 different colds for bleach, pre-wash, and main wash. So what had happened to us is that this center valve, which if we trace, you can see a bunch of tape left over. So this is actually already replaced. The valve I showed you earlier in the video is the old one that we took out. So I had a bunch of markings so I didn't lose track of which tube was which and everything when I was disassembling all of this initially. Anyway, we don't use the bleach or pre-wash very much, so the main wash is the one that was getting used a lot, and this valve was starting to fail. It was either getting clogged up, we have hard water, so there might have been some buildup in it, or the valve itself might have just been mechanically fatiguing over time, and our washing machine wasn't filling with water properly. So what I did initially, before we bought the entire replacement unit, was remove this and actually disassembled it and tried to just clean out that valve. So I'm not going to repeat that entire process in this video since I have already installed the new one here. But if we look on the back here, try not to cover up my microphone as I'm filming this, there's 2 screws on the back next to either side of the hose inlet, and if you unscrew those are what is holding this entire assembly on. So you can see, if we look at the one I took out, there's those 2 screw holes back there next to where the hose goes in. So if you take those out, then you can slide the entire thing out from the rear and replace this. So if you want to do that, you can take it apart, and then if you want to try and clean one of these valves even further, you can see that, I'm not going to do this in this video, but there's 4 individual screws for each one of the individual valves, so you can take the individual valve apart and see if you can clean it and then reinstall it and get it working again before you buy a replacement. Again, we tried that, reinstalled it, and then it still wasn't working, so I wound up replacing the whole thing. But I'll talk about another trick in a minute that you could potentially use to avoid replacing the entire thing. If you do decide to replace it, so not only do you have to take those screws out at the back, you also have to unplug all 3 of the wires here. And again, make sure you label things before you do that. So I label these left, middle, and right, because you don't want to not know where things plug in when you put the new one in. And then you also need to disconnect the hoses. These are pretty strong clamps on here, so you're probably going to want pliers to remove those. There's also going to be a little residual water in these tubes, so I got a towel and put it underneath here to kind of catch some of the water when it drained down. So you probably can't get these clamps with your fingers, but you can use pliers, let's see if I can show this, to squeeze those, pull them back on the tube, and then remove all 3 of these tubes, where again you can see I labeled them with tape for left, middle, and right, because you don't want to get them mixed up when you then go to put everything back together. Now, another trick that you could use if you don't want to replace the whole valve and repairing an if you don't want to replace the whole assembly with all 3 valves and repairing or cleaning an individual one didn't work, if you never use the bleach or the pre-wash cycles, then you can swap the connections for 2 of the valves. So for example, this center one here is my main wash. I have the tube connected to the main wash, and then over here on the left, if I trace that one, number 2, that's the pre-wash. So say I never use the pre-wash, I could swap these. So leave the valve assembly in place. If this was the damaged valve, this valve is still working because I almost never use it. So I take the wire and the tube off of this one, I take the wire and the tube off of this one, and then I swap them. So even though the valves are still physically in the same place, this one would now be getting the electrical signal for the main wash, and it would have the tube connected to main wash instead of pre-wash. So again, that only works if you never use the bleach or the pre-wash. We actually did that for a little bit while we were waiting for the new valve to arrive, because I have 2 small children, so going that long without doing any laundry at all was not really an option. But again, that's only a long-term solution if you never use the bleach or the pre-wash. We wanted to be able to use those features eventually, so I ordered the replacement valve and swapped the whole thing in. So to recap, disconnect power, shut off your supply lines, remove the hoses from the back, check the filters on the hoses to make sure those aren't clogged and preventing it from filling with water. Take your solenoid valve assembly, disconnect each one of the wires. First, label everything with a Sharpie or tape or whatever your preference is before you start taking stuff apart so you can put it back together later. Disconnect each of the wires from the solenoid valves. Use pliers to remove the 3 tubes. Unscrew these 2 screws on the back. That is going to let you get the entire assembly out. You can then further disassemble to try and clean out the individual valves, or you can buy a new one and replace the whole thing and then reconnect, or use the trick to swap around wires and tubes to just use one of the other valves if you never use the pre-wash or bleach functions. I cannot remember exactly where we bought this, but if I can find the Amazon link, I will put a link to this in the description.